Hello and good morning, and welcome to the second in the series of our webinars. I'm Lauren Maguire and I'm one of the consultants here at Avec. I'm very pleased to be joined by Nigel Ashley, CEO of Elevate Multi-Academy Trust, and by Julie Sowerby, one of Avec's directors. Our speakers today will discuss and evaluate successful MAT leadership. But before I hand you over to our speakers, I thought it would be good to give you a short overview of the work that we do across EPM and Avec Partnership. We only work in education, and our experts work in partnership with leaders to achieve school and trust improvement. Avec was formed in 2010 before becoming part of the EPM group in 2019, who are one of the largest and most comprehensive education services businesses in the sector. Our business supports over 2,500 schools, which includes over 200 trusts. If you have any questions today, please feel free to drop them into the chat facility, and we'll be sure to cover these during the Q&A at the end. I shall now hand you over to Julie.
Thanks, Lauren. Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning. Hopefully you'll find this an interesting session where we're going to look at some work that Nigel has done with regard to his trust and support that Avec gave to the trust and continue to give to the trust, as well as we continue to develop the central services functions for Elevate Multi-Academy Trust. I'm just going to run through the agenda. Nigel's going to give you some background information on Elevate, who they are, where they are. We're going to look at some legacy issues that we had to deal with, delivering value for money, and the development of the transparency of the central services offer. Looking at how we engage with key stakeholders, balancing the support offered from the centre and getting that balance right back out in school, and then looking at future-proofing for growth of the trust as well. So hopefully an interesting hour or so, and please, just to pick up on what Lauren said, we'd love your questions, and we've got a section at the end that we're able to respond to them as well. So I'd just like to welcome Nigel Ashley. Nigel has been working with Avec, and we've been working with Nigel for the last 4 years. It's been a real privilege. We started working with Elevate Multi-Academy Trust really as they were just being formed back in 2017, and it's been a real privilege to not only work with Nigel and his team around their growth and expansion, but a privilege in being involved in how they develop their central services model over this last 4-year period. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Nigel, and Nigel's going to take the first part of this session this morning.
Okay, thanks, Julie. Morning, everyone. I hope everyone's well. Before I begin, I think what I do want to say is I said I'd share our journey with you about how we've developed in the central services, but I think also, to be really clear, in no way am I sat here today feeling that we've completed that journey and our central services are all absolutely where they need to be. So it will be a case of sharing with you the journey, but also the warts and all part of it, the challenges we've faced and what we still need to complete. Today I want to start with a quote from Henry Ford at the top there, which is, "Coming together is a beginning, keeping together is a progress, and working together is success." Because I often think with multi-academy trusts, we think we're there when we come together. And actually, it's how we successfully work together that's all important. So we will look at that quote as we work through and talk about the different parts of how we've worked towards that. So Elevate, we were formed in July 2017, initially with 3 schools, 2 outstanding primary schools and 1 good primary. We developed quite quickly. We're not unique as a trust, but we are slightly different, and I will explain why. We very quickly grew to 8 primaries, and that was 4 outstanding and 4 good. So we were a trust that developed quickly through choice, and so what happened there was certainly developing with those schools. It gave us a little bit of capacity early on. We're a primary only trust, and so the reason for that being, we formed out of a teaching school alliance. We were quite a large teaching school alliance to begin. Sort of 4 years ago, we had over 70 members. So really, we had a shared sort of vision of what we were trying to achieve, which again we'll come back to later on. Another thing that makes us slightly different is we're a mixed multi-academy trust. So we are allowed to convert into our schools C of E schools from two dioceses, the Diocese of Leeds and the Diocese of York. What makes us slightly different is the founding school, which was a Medicide primary in Knaresborough, was actually a non-faith school. So we set up slightly differently in that we have a member board of 2 diocesan members, 2 non-diocesan members, and a religiously sympathetic organisation was how it was set up. And so what it does mean is a trust that we can convert into our trust schools from across the sort of West Yorkshire, all schools from the West Yorkshire and North Yorkshire area. The other part about us is we have started off, although it wasn't necessarily by design, in 3 locality areas. And if we just move to the next slide, I can explain that. So just testing your eyesight with that map there on the right hand side. But really, we're based in 3 areas at the moment. We're based out of Knaresborough, where we have we have 3 schools, and we recently was awarded a free school that will be built by September 23. And we're also based out of Thirsk, where we've got another, well, as you can see there from the map, another 5 schools in that area. And then recently we're moving into the Rydale area, a rural area of North Yorkshire, towards Scarborough. So as the slide says, there were 6 Church of England academies, 6 state academies. Of those 6, one of them is a free school we were awarded very early on in September 2020, and we'll have a 13th school which will be in Knaresborough in September 23, and we're also going to a 14th school this September when we're sponsoring a special measures school nearby. As mentioned, and it is really important for how we develop the central team, we did start with a lot of good and outstanding schools. So that is important just to note as we talk about central team, because I think what we really need to be clear about is every central team is different and meets the needs of your trust. So we obviously designed our central team around our needs. And then finally, just about trust information, we took those eight schools to begin with, and then we have converted 2 special measures schools since then, and we're looking to convert a 3rd. So again, if we could move on, please. I think for me, like I say, there's lots of things we got right and wrong, but the one thing I can't overstate is we came together with a shared educational vision. And in the very early days, we worked with somebody called Dame Rena Keeble from down in London, who worked with us around developing our educational philosophy. And so across our trust, we have a shared, what we call a keep up, not catch up philosophy. Now, this was sort of 5 years old, and you see that quite a lot now from that term quite a lot. The reason why it's important is where we are, our driver is education, and the purpose of our central functionality is to support us in the drive for education. So everything comes back to education. So if we look at where we start with our challenges, then so the big issue at the start, and one of the mistakes when we looked about the central team and looked at setting up the trust, is because we had so many schools that were doing extremely well, had outstanding judgments, high results. We talked a lot about autonomy, and I made the mistake very early on of going to a lot of local governing bodies. I remember it well, and using the term earned autonomy, and if you join our trust, that you will continue to run in a way that's autonomous. Now, being very open about that, we very, very quickly realised that actually earned autonomy is a bit of a myth. When you have a centralised service, the clue's really in the name. It's a centralised service, and this is at the first point. And I will come back to Avec and Julie and the team and working with them. Avec helped me realise very early on that actually there's some key areas you need to standardise very quickly. You need to make some very the sooner you make some of your toughest decisions, the better. The longer you leave it, the more painful it becomes, and we'll discuss that. So first of all, I think for us as primaries, and I'm not sure how you're finding it as you develop your trust, there was primaries at times can be big families. People get on very well and they're very supportive of each other. And as you're creating your team and your central team, actually what you're looking for is efficiency and effectiveness in the delivery of your services. And the toughest decision we had was that actually within our schools, and I'm going to sort of move down that list, we found that really business managers was something that as we started our trust we wouldn't particularly need. We needed a centralised service that serviced all of our schools rather than individual people within individual schools. So we did make the decision right from the start to remove business managers. Now that was a tough decision. It was probably one of the best decisions we took at the start. To give you an idea now, it really saves us about £100,000 plus a year across our trust. But ultimately what the challenge there at the start was how schools responded to that, because those business managers were often how do I put that, they were the people that were quite paternalistic within the schools. They were the ones that looked after everybody because they were the people in classrooms. So it was a tough decision. So very early on when we made that decision, for myself as CEO, I led in that process so that the heads were supported by myself and Avec supported me in that process. I think another challenge we had at the start when it came to creating our team and looking at what we had, we didn't have the specialist knowledge because we were primary schools. Again, we didn't have the HR finance knowledge that maybe some of the secondary trusts have as they begin. So that was a challenge. We also had a major challenge around financial projections. I remember my chair of trust, who was a partner in a large accountancy firm in Leeds, telling us on the very first meeting that if we were any other business, he'd be looking to wrap us up. After the first meeting, we were looking at a £600,000 deficit. So we were looking at some major problems there. As primaries, we were struggling with accommodation and where to put the central team. North Yorkshire and West Yorkshire, for that matter, have sort of plans where whenever you convert schools, they redline out anything that you might use for premises if you can't demonstrate it's being used solely for education. And then finally, for myself as a primary school head teacher of 15 years, total ignorance. And I think this where it comes across to the fact I had no idea the enormity of the journey I was about to, and the trust we're about to set out on. And I think that's where, if we move to the next slide, please, I think that's where it's how we worked with people at the start that helped us create a system that worked. So I'm looking at Julie in the bottom corner there, and I remember very early on I was introduced to Julie and Julie's partner, Sarah, business partner Sarah, who supported me right from day one in the creation of the trust. And I think for me, the major advantage I had from day one was they enabled me, through being critical friends, to not make some of the mistakes other trusts have done. And I think one thing that we have done is work very hard at learning from what other trusts have done in the past. And I think the first thing as mentioned was really understanding what those major problems will be later on and developing your solution very early to that. So Avec supported us very much as critical friends. They had the knowledge. We did use Avec services very early on, everything from HR to finance, and I will come to our structures in a moment. And also, really importantly, the strategy for not just phase one of the developing of the central team, as we'll look at in a moment, but also phase two, which is don't just plan for today, plan for tomorrow. And I think that's vital for us, because I class Elevate as what I would say is a big little trust. like I say, we're 12. We're going to be 15 schools basically in the next 3 months. So that puts us in the top 20% of trusts in the country for number of schools within the first 3 years of growth. But actually, we're in the bottom 25% of trusts in the country for the number of pupils. So we're not yet even 3,000 pupils. So we have some very interesting challenges. I think the other things there that we need. Sorry, thank you. The other things there that we work very closely with is I did have a mentor at the start, a very interesting mentor. I won't name names, but let's just say it was a trust that went spectacularly wrong and made national news. And I learned as much from that person as from a trust that was going well. And we do try and work really closely with other trusts. So if we could move on again, please. So this was ours and Avec's first iteration at what our structure was going to be, Julie. I found this way back in one of my folders about what our intention was as a starting centralised team. And looking at that, actually, not only did we have that structure, but we had the phase 2 structure that looks very much like what we've got now. So we haven't differed too much within that structure there. We didn't have a dedicated PA. That was a luxury we couldn't afford, and actually the poor trust H and payroll manager ended up doing both jobs. But no, that's the structure we started with for our first schools. We did have to look at, and the challenge was bringing in the people that we couldn't afford to just start again. So we did move across business managers, and we did have some hardship in the early days of people having to move into roles that they didn't necessarily wouldn't have chosen, shall we say. And that did have an impact on creating the team. I think we did have some real dynamic issues with team members who were used to working in their primary school, were very happy in that environment. And Avec needed to support us in the early days with how we developed that team, and we did take the tough decisions as we generated more income to maybe move some of those team members on. One thing also, as well as sort of becoming more efficient and saving the money on the business managers, we did look at the school administrator's role, and Julie worked with us on creating one standard administrator role across all of our schools in the trust. In the old days of Band 6, everybody was employed on a Band 6, and they became our meet and greet people for the schools. I was really concerned as a former head teacher there'd be too much and that there'd be a lot of kickback on that. And actually that went really smoothly. And so every administrator across the trust now is the equivalent of those Band 6s and does the meet and greet functionality. And for primary schools, that's been a very cost-effective way of doing it. We also had to manage the expectations for staff, because head teachers were very keen to protect people and very keen to still try and maintain as much as they could back in the school. And we had to be really clear that this is a centralised service. So we did work on that, but we did maintain external support. So if we look at that model, those external advisors at the second box down on the right there, we did maintain Avec's finance support, HR and legal support. And actually, I have to say that was absolutely the right thing to do in the early days. We didn't want to make those mistakes, particularly around finance. So we did use those services. And actually, even now we're a much bigger central service. We still use HR and we still have some finance as well. Okay, thank you. I did see a question from yesterday about top slice, and top slice is a very, very emotive subject. We start by taking 5% in the first year and then 7.5%. Now that looks quite a large sum of money, 7.5% as a top slice. But actually, because we've also taken on the staffing, I think what all trusts need to do, and the best advice I can give anybody, is share really clearly with people what your centralised service is providing, and so that they can see how much they are getting back compared to what they used to get with the local authority, for instance, or even financially how much not paying their business managers, etc., saves them. So we do take 7.5%, and actually our schools have found that they can that's something that hasn't had a negative impact on their budgets. In fact, post conversion, they found they had more money in the budget than prior to conversion. I think it's also really important with your top slice that you deliver a costed service so they can see exactly what it is they're getting. So we've been very clear about that. And one thing we did try to do and failed miserably is try to unpick LA services and show the difference in cost, because we could never get there, but something that we were asked quite often. But no, schools, nobody flinches about our top slice. Nobody asks questions or ever challenges. So it's a reflection of how financially the schools are doing. Okay, thank you. And that's roughly where we are today in the structure and the services. So in some ways it hasn't grown too much, and I do want to talk about being prepared for the next stage, because we do have a few more people. I think looking across those areas, one thing that isn't on there that we do have is I do now have a deputy CEO, and I think one of the key changes really is the chief financial officer. I think, and the finance within school. I think our heads would very much accept that financially they're much more accountable now, and I don't mean that. I mean that in a strategic way. So we work very, very closely with our schools on their finances. So we still allow schools to work and manage their budgets and set their budgets with our support. We did ask at the start that they set a 5% surplus to build a reserve, which they all but one school has managed, and now we've moved that down to 3% surplus, and that surplus is something that we allow the schools to. We set that 3% almost wriggle room, and then if things happen through the year, they've got something so they're not going into a negative budget. We're much more challenging with them on monthly monitoring. So, you know, if things start to go awry, we're catching it early. We've also got rid of the myth that the third year is not important. So again, it was through advice through Avec about managing those budgets really tightly that we don't let heads say, well, the third year column doesn't matter. It does matter. And I think there's some schools that have come unstuck. And a big thing is, from very early on through the scheme of delegation, we ensured the LGB understood it wasn't in control of individual finances. Now, that's always a challenging thing to do, but actually, because we've set up other systems where local governing bodies have direct meetings with myself, etc., that's not been as big an issue. Again, using the example of big little trust with finance, we've really worked on some of our contracts, and because we have so many schools, we've made some major savings. We've just recently made 70,000 on catering a year back, 30,000 on staff insurance, and also we've been able to negotiate better services with local authority, etc. So financially, we've had a lot of things to do. HR and payroll. I think the biggest thing is, and I can't thank Julie enough for this one, is it feels very different being HR when you're not part of a local authority, because it always felt as a head teacher, the HR team was supporting both sides of anything, and actually you never felt supported. I think the massive difference we have now is when we have HR discussions, they're strategic HR discussions and plan for the future. We try and avoid issues, but if issues come up, you feel that there's somebody there that's got your back and can give you really good advice. So HR has been something that's been a seismic shift, I found, from being a head teacher to being part of a trust, and I know our head teachers in the trust feel that. Governance and compliance is a really interesting one, because I do some mentoring of other trusts, and one thing that's really stood out for me is get your governance and compliance done from day one. Make sure everybody understands totally where they stand, and I really do mean LGBs in this. So our centralised service, our governance, legal and compliance person attends every governor meeting, and that's a massive ask, but the reward has been substantial. We're able to deal with issues straight away, and we have a unified We have a unified trust where we speak with one voice. I'm extremely lucky in that post, in the sense that it's a I was lucky enough to be able to employ a trained barrister who came to me for a lot less than she should have done. So that was one of those where you were lucky. You got one of those diamonds in the rough that I mentioned earlier. Massively for us, facilities and health and safety, because we've got so many premises, that's a challenge, and we're still continuing to work on that one. And as we've got bigger, PR and marketing is becoming more important. School improvement, I'm not really touching on today, but because our drive is education, we invest heavily in there. We have nearly 400 days of school improvement that we invest in every year. And really one of our major mistakes, we didn't get ICT sorted at the start. We didn't have the skilled person within the trust. We couldn't afford it. And so that is one of the areas we're backtracking on now to get that right. Okay, thank you. So lessons learned. I think first and foremost, it's learning from others. We were very open to the advice we got. We were very clear, and getting that advice that we did, like I said, through Avec, through others, was really important. Why make the same mistakes others have made? We see that trusts go through growing pains after about 3 years. And so one of the things we've done is made sure we overstaff centrally, so that when you grow at that 3rd year, you don't have the issues. And again, that was advice we took. These are Julie's words, I'm quoting Julie now, but you're concentrating on structures and not people. So I thought that was really good advice at the start. So it's very easy to get a motive about people that have worked in the organisation for years, but actually it's a new business, and the business is education, and the central team's got to support that. So we did concentrate on that. As much as you can, if you've got the finances set up as everything efficiently from the beginning, because if you think I'm going to do something in a couple of years, and there's things like ICT we did, it doesn't necessarily work. It becomes too late in a challenge. Plan for your next stage before you're there. We're very lucky that my performance management's done by the ex-RSC, who supported me around this. Avec have supported me around this. So it's being ready now. And a big challenge for me, and I don't know if anybody who's listening finds this as well, there's a big difference from being a head teacher when you knew exactly how much money you had at the start of each year, and you knew how to spend it, whereas often as a trust you have no idea what income, what grants you're getting. So it was quite frightening, if I'm being truthful, trying to spend money before it arrived. But that's you have to strategically plan, and again, that's where the support's been invaluable. So again, if we could move on, please. So where it's really worked for us, I absolutely can't overstate the fact that we had a driver was education. We were unified. Those first 8 schools all were going in the same direction, and all were trying to achieve that same educational philosophy. That bonds us. I worry about trusts that try and sell the trust growth based on a centralised service or finance. It's got to be education as your driver. We manage growth. We actually have turned away 12 schools so far. So there are some trusts that grow at all costs. We could have been much bigger. So we have managed how we've done that, and also we've managed our growth in blocks. So we got 3 in first, then another 3, then a 2. So instead of trying to bring everybody else engaged with the community, my passion is that we are accountable and responsibility to the communities we serve, not the communities being responsible to us. And I think that engagement has enabled us to develop that centralised services that actually the schools do feel support them. Get support, you don't know it all. It's like I say, if I'd known the enormity of what we're setting out on, it would have frightened me off, if I'm being honest. The other thing that we've been incredibly successful at, and Julie reminds me of quite frequently, is quite how well we've done with our funding streams. I sat down before this presentation to work out, and in 3 years, if you include the free schools, we've got over £18 million worth of funding. 14 of that's locked away in 2 schools being built, but we've had sort of nearly £500,000 in TCAF funding. And I think my advice to you, and we've been successful every year. Obviously, as we've been growing quite quickly, that's been a help. But I would also say to you around the TCAF, just know the agenda, know what the agenda is for the year and make sure you're ticking the box. So last year we got quite a lot based around a rural growth hub, and it was knowing that. And then because we sit below 3,000 pupils, we've also done exceptionally well out of the Conditioning Improvement Fund. We've had £3.5 million in the last 3 years. And then finally, really for this slide, it's about not growing at all costs. Because you've got to be financially viable, and it is that plan about. I feel we've been through good advice, quite successful in the expansion and growth, planning for that growth and being ready for it. And I think if we can just go to the last slide, please. So what it comes to, and my trustees and myself talk a lot about the step costs. It's about, we don't take on schools if we don't feel that we're in a place to be able to meet the needs of the children in those schools. And we work very closely on taking those schools on. Are we going to financially be able to provide the centralised services, the step costs as we call them? So we've always worked on a model that the trustees challenge me, do the rest of the schools suffer if you take on other schools? Because what we've got to be clear about is how we manage that growth and whether we can afford to get to the next stage. So we do benchmark against other trusts. We do look at that. We do look at the executive leadership structure. I brought in a deputy CEO. We do manage how we use consultants, and Julie and Sarah have been exceptionally good at working with us on. They don't just try and sell us a service. Right from day one, they've said your plan is to work with us for the services you need. So the bigger you get, the fewer the services you need, and that's how we've worked it, and that's worked extremely well and has developed a very trusting and supportive relationship. And as I've already said to you, it's then just the planning for the next stage. It always makes me smile when we sit to write 3 and 5 year growth plans, and because quite frankly, it takes a telephone call and you're going in a different direction again. So planning for the next stage, you need all those support, but it's very challenging as well. So I think, Julie, at this point, that's a quick rush through where I am.
Thank you, Nigel. That was brilliant. Thank you. And a really honest overview, which you don't often get, such honesty around, the challenges, the joys of forming a trust, but the real challenges that I know you've faced over the last 4 years as well. So thank you so much for that. I'm just going to take us through a few slides, which very much is the approach that we use. So brilliant to hear everything that Nigel's told us about elevating the trust and the growth. A lot of our role was very much to work with Nigel and the trust board, and we work in a very challenging way with them. And Nigel often used to say, how much we would challenge their thinking, but ultimately they made some very brave decisions for me, and having absolute clarity over the key and most important purpose of Elevate Multi-Academy Trust, which is children, standards, outcomes, their education, and keeping that constantly as a core focus of everything we did actually makes things a little bit easier, and it actually quite often makes it difficult to argue against. So it was great to actually be involved with that level of work as well. When we first started working with Nigel, you've heard, when all the numbers stacked up with the early schools in the trust, the trust were looking at a £600,000 deficit. That's huge. And for a primary trust, as Nigel said again, you can have a lot of schools, but not a lot of pupils. And what we all know is it's the pupils that bring the funding. So a real challenge there that we had to set forward on to balance the books, and not just balance the books, but manage and achieve some surplus. But actually, one of the things that Nigel did very early on was not make a commitment to say nothing will change to the schools that were joining the trust. And I actually think that's really important. The minute you start attracting schools into your trust and saying, you know, oh, nothing will change when you come and join us, well, that really sets you on the back foot, because actually things do have to change. Nigel said it himself. They're a different business now as a multi-academy trust, and you've got to recognise that. So delivering really positive messages about change, but actually what we then went on from the early days, I think around about the autumn term of 2017 into 2018, we started on quite a significant change programme. And really what I'm sharing with you here is where we started out, and we actually made sure we invested really a lot of time in winning hearts and minds, and that phrase can be quite overused, I think, but we felt it was really important because things were going to change, and they were going to change considerably. And actually not everybody would be there at the end of this change that was there at the beginning. So we worked really closely with Nigel's trust board, and they had to make some pretty brave decisions about moving forward, and they didn't do that lightly. You know, we took into account, you've heard Nigel talk about they're a mixed mat, they're mixed, you know, they've got Church of England schools in the trust, and so we took these steps carefully and well thought through. But ultimately, when the trust board made their decisions about the structure going forward, then we stuck to the plan. But we had to do a lot of work with head teachers. We found that a lot of generally quite small schools had some very expensive support staff in the schools. Who had absolutely brilliant skills. They were great people, a really strong skill set, but we were never going to achieve the formation of a central team and start to think about savings if we continued to support that role of a very expensive business manager out in a very small rural school. But you can imagine those people were great people, and their head teachers depended on them an awful lot. So what we ultimately ended up with the central services team, we had to make sure it was even better. And that was really important, that what they were going to get going forward was really even better than what they'd had up until that point. So we worked through, and I've used a slide that we used almost throughout the whole of our informal and formal consultation processes with the head teachers and with the staff who would be affected by these changes as well. So we were really clear that we wanted to support this capacity and sustainability for growth for the trust, and that's very much the focus and what we've done. We wanted to ensure that we were compliant, and compliance, as you all know, if you're working in trusts, you know, just gets ranked up every year. But we have to make sure from a central trust perspective that we're compliant with all the legal and regulatory responsibilities of a trust. We obviously have to make sure we're compliant with the Academy's financial handbook. That was critical, and again, we see a new version of that every year with changes that we need to make sure as a multi-academy trust that we're making sure we're complying with everything that's in there. We wanted to actually free up head teachers so that they could completely focus on teaching and learning and really deliver that education vision for the MAT. You heard from Nigel, in the early days, the MAT grew out of schools wanting to join Elevate. Elevate's got such a strong reputation around school improvement and raising outcomes and standards that schools were lining up wanting to join. but we felt it was really important that we had to allow head teachers to focus on what that meant. And freeing up, if my business partner was on the line, she calls it the gubbins, freeing up all the gubbins of the role of a head teacher. The finance, you know, not necessarily everything, but just being able to get a greater focus on teaching and learning was a real driver for the changes we were going to bring about. And actually, you might think head teachers would be chomping at the bit to have all of those other things taken away from them, but we had to do a little bit of work with them. It wasn't an instant, oh, that's amazing, thank you very much, I can't wait. We still needed to work through what that was going to mean for them. Going forward, working with the central team, losing what they would see as losing the support from their business managers. We also needed to strike that balance. We needed to get the structures right, but we needed to make sure they were lean and cost effective, and make sure really that there was sufficient for the trust to function as well. And we wanted to make sure that there was a combination of internal capacity and external support. And Nigel has spoken this morning very much about the support that Avec has given. But I think as a trust, they've never put their eggs all in one basket. Elevate has seen the benefit of having and growing and developing their own team, but looking beyond that for experience and an external perspective that you quite often get and should get where you're getting services from an external organisation. And I know Nigel's done that across the board, not just with Avec, but also from a school improvement angle as well. Very much about getting the right balance and not having absolutely everything sat in the trust, getting the balance between the two, the internal team and the external support. We went on to share these really clear principles about the central trust team, and very much what we talked to head teachers and staff about was having transparency for this service, that it would be really clear if you're a head teacher in one of the schools sat in Thirsk, you would know really clearly what you were paying for and what you were getting, and I think that was a really important step. Absolute clarity, absolute transparency. So no questions asked. If we talk to a head, they know very much what's coming out of their budget and what they're going to get for that amount of money. I've mentioned about being as lean as possible, but equally it's getting the balance right about being able to function effectively. There may have been times in the early days we were a bit too lean on the Elevate structure, and you know, we really had to work through that because you know, being too lean means we're not delivering the services from the centre that really needed to be delivered, and it was actually putting additional pressure on the staff who had moved into that central team and were taking on new roles as well. So just making sure we weren't too lean was pretty important, and really making sure that there was a clear business plan and KPIs for the work of the central team. And I know very much through doing some work with Nigel around the development of this structure and the trust employing a deputy CEO, the deputy CEO role is very much around the functions and operations of the central team. I come across deputy CEOs who have a very strong school improvement role, but in Elevate, this is very much about this central team. And I know that's very much the area that the deputy CEO is focusing on, is around the business plan for the trust, the growth of the trust, but the development of that central team, how that continues to develop and grow as the trust grows as well, and how they can be held accountable for the services that they're delivering to the schools within the trust, to the central team themselves and to the trust board. We wanted to make sure that there was high quality value for money services, where schools know the level of support that they're getting. And we also needed to make sure that schools retain sufficient support back in their own school. So we did quite a bit of work around this area with head teachers to say, if we remove all of these elements from school that you no longer need to have to do day in and day out, what is it that you need to continue back in school? And we developed a role that exists across all schools. It is a very multi-purpose role. So it will be somebody who will be at reception, who will be supporting the photocopying, dealing with parents coming into school, and those sorts of things, but a fairly relatively low level. We did some work with the heads around making sure that we got the amount of time that they needed for that role correct. And we actually came up with a model that would sit between 2 part-time posts for most of the smaller schools. But equally, we also then had to be quite firm with heads about making sure they didn't sign up to the central model and then go off and employ 2 or 3 more staff within school. So we were pretty clear with them about the consequences of doing that, and actually, in effect, they had to get permission around any additional posts for school level admin that they wanted. They'd have to pay for all of that out of their own budget. And part of getting permission for doing that was very much around making sure that we didn't end up with equal pay issues across the trust, because we had brought everybody into trust terms and conditions. And what we really didn't want to happen is that suddenly one head employed somebody on a higher grade, and that would then ultimately cause us problems across other schools in the trust as well. But heads have signed up to that, and I don't think we've had anybody who's been too naughty in trying to circumvent the model. And I think that very much is about getting the heads all signed up to this in the first place. So I've talked quite a bit about how we achieve these things already, but we did spend quite a lot of time understanding the existing structures. And you can imagine, as a newly formed MAT, there were a little bit all over the place. Nigel's trust spans different local authority areas as well. So we had, different issues about pay and grading because of the outcomes of job evaluation in those local authority areas. We also wanted to understand their education focus and actually their costs. So we did a lot of work, not just the HR team, but working with our finance colleagues as well, just making sure we fully understood all of this. I've mentioned already, we worked with the trust board at length, making sure that they were fully engaged with the plans and were committed to them, and likewise with the head teachers. We really did establish the why we need to do this, and I've pretty much gone through that with you. And we stuck to this even when things got really difficult. And this isn't an easy process by any means. And things did get difficult at times, but we stuck to the why. And having that absolute clarity at the outset that we worked through with the heads, with the staff, actually got us through the more difficult situations we had to deal with. This process allowed us to develop the Elevate pay and grading model, which clearly helps for all new appointments in a multi-academy trust. And actually, it really helped with the implementation of the new structure post-TUPE, because of course, in the early days, we were dealing with staff who had all TUPE'd into Elevate Multi-Academy Trust. Certainly Nigel and I were well prepared for challenges, but we accepted there would be challenges in the process, and we listened. We took on board the impact of these changes. But I would just come back to the why. we still stuck to the clear educational rationale for what it was we were looking to achieve. We did invest a lot of time with staff. We did that in groups, we did it individually. There was quite a number of times we worked in groups with them because we wanted to make sure they all heard the same message, and we felt that was important. But we did start very early on working with them in a very informal way as well. So of course there's always the very formal processes to follow when you're making these changes, but we started that much earlier. So really, by the time we got to the formal stuff, we didn't want any surprises for anybody. That was pretty important for us. And equally, we worked really closely with trade union colleagues across the area of the trust as well. And you know, we'll all admit sometimes that can be a bit of a pain, but it was critical. And actually, working with trade union colleagues really helped us move forward and achieve the initial formation of the central team in a pretty quick timeline once we'd started moving this on, and you know, that was credit to the trade unions knowing you know, the why and understanding what we were looking to achieve, and you know, clearly representing their members in a positive way as well. We did find, as I think you always will do in these situations, that all staff were open to the change, and we were prepared for this, and we did factor in contingencies into the whole process, so that we could hopefully manage that effectively as well. And I think generally I would say we did manage the change, and we were able to support colleagues who maybe you know, didn't want this big step change into being part of a central team, but we factored that in, and we were prepared for that. And I've gone through with you, but those clear principles for the purpose of the central team, again, we just stuck to these, and we still talk about them today. So I had a call with the Deputy CEO last Friday, and we were still talking in those principles of the basis of the central team. So we were still coming back to that. They've been really important in really making sure that we've achieved what we've got to achieve. So implementation and beyond, having that clear education focused strategy is absolutely critical. Every multi-academy trust is in the business of education and nothing else. And that was really important, because I think I said right at the beginning, it's really difficult to argue against that. We spent time with the trust board. We spent time on hearts and minds with head teachers and staff. We fully understood and prepared for the changes post-TUPE. And I'm a HR person, and one of my mantras is procedure, 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 but we stuck to it as well. And so we achieved what we set out to achieve. I would say by the time we formed the central team, in a relatively easy way. It worked, and it worked really well. We had really clear timelines for implementation, and we didn't let anything get in the way of those timelines either. We were prepared for that disruption and challenge, but again, we stuck to the reasons and the rationale about why we were doing this. We had the contingencies, and we went forward and we implemented. And I do a lot of work with trusts around their central team and forming it or changing it as they expand. And sometimes actually that last point doesn't happen. But again, I think it goes right the way back to the beginning, and having that clear rationale and having the trust board on board with the changes and making sure that we did fully implement the central services restructure, which over time has then continued to grow and expand as Elevate have grown and expanded as well. It actually also makes it more straightforward for us to be able to deal with new schools joining the trust as well, because we have absolute clarity, and we can start talking to head teachers very early about what it means about being in Elevate from a central team perspective. That's me. I've just had a bit of a 5-minute warning. I have warned the team. Nigel and I do like to talk a little bit, but equally we're really passionate about what we've done as well. But I think we've got an opportunity for some questions now. So we've had a question about whether we've had any experience of merging admin level roles across functions. So that's, you know, maybe colleagues who work across finance, HR, premises, admin. And if we have, what's been the benefit of this? We actually took a little bit of a different approach, which you'll probably be aware of now. So we had quite distinct functions. So at the central team, we had a finance specialist, HR, facilities, governance and compliance. So we went down a little bit more of the specialist route with that one. But actually out at school level, those admin roles I talked about, you know, yes, they're lower level admin jobs, but they may well span 2 or 3 different areas. But certainly at the central team, we went for the more specialist role. I've got another one here. I'm going to read it out, but I think Nigel might like to comment on this. So another question is, why are so many schools obsessed with the top slice percentage rather than the value of the service they receive? I could have said that myself, if I'm being honest. What can we do to make some schools realise that they're significantly under-resourced in support services, which is partly why their schools do not run smoothly? I'm going to hand over to Nigel to reply to that one.
Thanks, Julie. I think the honest answer to that is sometimes primary school, well, if it is a primary or secondary, don't know what they haven't had before. So I think there is a level of ignorance about that they just accept the services. I think another thing again is that there is a challenge when you schools join your trust, that the worry is that they're going to come along and take all your money and take all of your autonomy. And I think it's about really how we manage that was being really clear about all the extra services you get in, sharing that with them, then being involved in that discussion and actually sharing with them the impact within their budgets. Because I mean, I think the one thing that we found, managed well, school budgets are better. So I mean, that one thing I didn't share with you is, you know, our schools now sit across all of them with nearly a £2 million reserve, which is a long way away from that £500,000 worth of deficit. So it really is about being clear with them about these are the things you get, and you can continue to build on that. So across our trust now, which has been really warmly welcomed, our central services is developing into SEND provision, and we're providing SEND support across the trust, things that they've just lost recently. And so actually, if anything, we are now starting to find other schools looking, particularly after COVID, around seeing what these schools have had. And I do think COVID for trusts, how do I put this? Nobody would want to go through COVID, but I do feel that academies and multi-academy trusts have been able to support their schools more through their central services than maybe local authority colleagues. So schools are seeing what they're missing, and actually our next stage of growth very much seems like the schools that are wanting to get on board with the additional services. So just be really clear about what they're getting.
That's great. Thanks, Nigel. You know, I would just echo that really about, you know, setting out right at the outset exactly what it is you're going to get for your money. And if it's 5, 7.5 or 20%, if it's really clear exactly what you're going to get for your money, I generally find the schools accept that as well. And it's been really clear about what you sit into the centre to. You know, that varies from trust to trust, but clearly the more you can sit in the centre, I think that the greater economy of scale you're going to start to develop as well. Thank you. I think we've had all of our questions, so thank you so much for that. I'm going to hand back to Lauren.
Thank you. Firstly, a huge thank you to our speakers today, Nigel Ashley and to Julie Sowerby, for a truly excellent session. I hope you've all enjoyed it. Thank you to everyone who has attended. I hope you found the session informative. My colleague Chantal Carter will be in touch in due course to follow up on any key points and answer any other questions that you may have. So please feel free to email her in the meantime, but she will be in touch shortly. Our webinar on CEO pay and performance with Jan Reno is due to be rescheduled in the near future. So Chantal will be in touch as soon as we have a date agreed and with invitations. If you could all take 1 minute to fill in our survey, we'd really appreciate it, and give us a thumbs up once completed. It'd be hugely helpful for ensuring that we cover the right topics and make the webinars as useful as possible to you. But thank you once again for a truly excellent session.